Hi, my name is Amina Abdu, and I'm excited to present joint work with Irene Pasquetto and Abigail titled An Empirical Analysis of Racial Categories in the Algorithmic Fairness Literature. To motivate this talk, I want to convince you of two things. First, that we should care about racial classification, and second, that we should care specifically about algorithmic fairness as an important site where racial classification occurs. So first and foremost, racial classification is an important social question with material consequences for how cultural, political, and economic resources are allocated. Moreover, anti-discrimination efforts, including those undertaken by the algorithmic fairness community, require having some notion of which groups are discriminated against. However, this requires care, in particular because racial classification has been weaponized toward a variety of goals, oftentimes reinforcing existing power structures. While there are numerous historical examples I could point to, I want to emphasize that these dangers are not only in the past. In particular, the state of Louisiana is currently undertaking an effort to manipulate racial classification to disenfranchise Black voters by reclassifying multiracial Black residents as non-Black. Finally, one key thing to keep in mind is that institutions play an important role in the project of racial classification, and we can see this in particular through scientific institutions and the state. So now, why should we care about algorithmic fairness in particular? We argue that algorithmic fairness has emerged as a race-making institution with two important characteristics. First, its algorithmic nature requires that race categories be explicitly and quantitatively formalized, crystallizing racial classification decisions in new ways. Second, algorithmic fairness is extra-legal, but still often attempts to inform policy, meaning that classification decisions that might have been the purview of traditional policymakers and domain experts are now instead in the hands of technologists and algorithmic fairness researchers. So there's already been important work critiquing racial classification practices in the algorithmic fairness community. These critiques have raised two key issues: the tendency to treat race as individual rather than relational, and the tendency to treat race as fixed rather than contextual. The critical literature gestures toward two important reasons for these issues. The first is the uncritical adoption of legal conceptions of race, and in particular, the US notion of protected classes. And the second is the uncritical reproduction of biological conceptions of race. So once again here, with legal and biological conceptions, we see science and the state looming large. Despite the important critical groundwork that's already been laid out, we argue that there are a few things that merit further attention. First, an empirical analysis to take stock of how these critiques play out in practice. And second, the existing critiques take a view that algorithmic fairness is uncritically reproducing racial classification practices and values institutionalized elsewhere without examining the algorithmic fairness community as its own race-making entity with its own specific set of values. To fill this gap, we propose the following questions. First, how is race operationalized and conceptualized in the algorithmic fairness literature? Second, how do algorithmic fairness researchers justify their analytic decisions around the operationalization of race? And finally, third, how do values appear alongside operationalizations of race? To answer these questions, we perform a manual content analysis of papers published between 2018 and 2020 at FACT to understand how the community's racial classification norms emerged during the initial years of the conference. We subset to papers that are about fairness, which we identify by their use of fairness-related terms within the abstract, and we subset again to papers which mention race at least once, which would, for example, exclude papers that discuss fairness exclusively in terms of gender. These criteria left us with a total of 60 papers. To analyze the sample, we created an iterative qualitative coding scheme to identify formal operationalizations of race, as well as broader conceptualizations of race, and basically how racial difference is understood within papers. We also looked at justifications given for a particular operationalization of race used in a paper. And finally, we looked at the values expressed within each paper. And that brings us to our results, which I'll summarize at a high level here, but of course more details can be found in the paper itself. So going back to our first research question, how is race operationalized and conceptualized in the algorithmic fairness literature? The short story here is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in how researchers choose to operationalize race. Racial classification schemas vary between papers and sometimes even within the same paper. even the most common schema, a two-category black and white schema, is only used in about 18% of the papers in our sample. There's also a substantial variety in how race is conceptualized more broadly. So while legal conceptions of race are common, as we might expect based on the existing critical literature, this conceptualization is still present in fewer than half of papers. Some other common conceptualizations that we see include race as a social status category, and race as a sort of more abstract, sensitive attribute, a term from the computer science privacy literature. So moving on to our second question, how do algorithmic fairness researchers justify their analytic decisions around the operationalization of race? We find that most papers do not justify their choices. Only about a fifth of the papers we looked at provided any justification of race, and even if we look exclusively at the papers that explicitly state the racial categories that they're using, a substantial majority of these decisions are also not justified. And although most papers in our sample don't justify their choices, we think there's something to learn from the few that do. So to that end, we present a taxonomy of justifications. First, we see a host of practical reasons. So things like technical considerations, such as algorithm constraints or computational efficiency. We also see compatibility with data, which oftentimes are collected by someone other than the researchers. And we see epistemic concerns like reliability, consistency, or objectivity. In addition to these technical concerns and practical concerns, we see justifications that center the contextual relevance of a chosen schema. For example, its relevance to the problem being studied or the social context. And ideally, this is the type of justification we might aspire to in order to avoid the pitfalls of under-theorized conceptions of race and to understand the suitability of fairness interventions. Finally, we note that prior work is used to justify decisions, which reveals the way that norms and decisions might become naturalized over time within the fairness community and can point us toward the importance of attending to these norms. And finally, this brings us to our third question: how do values appear alongside race categories? I won't go into too much detail here, but the important takeaway is that different conceptualizations of race are associated with different values in our findings. Because of this, we argue that visibility practices are crucial for surfacing the values embedded within decisions about how to operationalize race. I'll take the remaining time here to discuss some of the implications of our findings. A few reminders from the literature. Recall that existing critiques of algorithmic fairness primarily focus on the influence of legal and biological conceptions of race. These critiques also center the dangers of acontextual and under-theorized operationalizations of race, which aligns with our findings about the lack of justification presented in our sample. From the broader racial classification literature, we know that classification is political and shaped by institutions, which will help point us toward some proposed interventions. With that in mind, we find substantial heterogeneity in both racial classification schemas and values. While legal frameworks are prominent, as we might expect given the existing critical literature, they have not produced anything close to a consensus and are far from the only story here. In particular, we find that values and norms from academic computer science are influential in shaping racial classification practices in the algorithmic fairness literature. While differences in racial classification schemas and values are not necessarily bad, and in fact may be useful given the situated and contextual nature of race, the lack of justification makes it pretty difficult to assess these differences. This is important because operationalization decisions matter. Given the literature and our own findings, we know that values are embedded in operationalization decisions. There are extensive examples of race categories being manipulated toward various ends. Because of this, the significant flexibility and lack of justification we find becomes particularly concerning. We propose that institutional reforms present an important path forward. We draw on Hannah Brown's work on state racemaking, in which Brown presents 3 institutional factors that shape racialization practices: evidentiary standards, record-keeping requirements, and incentives. We argue that these 3 institutional factors also appear within the algorithmic fairness community through, for example, publishing standards, documentation requirements and norms, and corporate influence. As such, the algorithmic fairness community and these institutions within it have an important opportunity to reshape these factors toward visibility and care in racial classification. Thank you.